To continue with our landscape comparison, I wanted to pull out some of Barnett's ideas about landscape and how you can come to a deeper meaning of the image and the content, what is implied by what's going on here. So here we have a beautiful landscape by Van Rijsdael. He's a Dutch landscape painter. And what Barnett says is examine the role of people in the landscape. What do they represent in their relationship to the landscape? And here in this scene by Van Rijsdael, we see that there are people down here, but they are minuscule. They are definitely not the focus. The focus is the light and the land and the sky here. Because the people are below the horizon line, they are, and very, very small, they are of less importance than the nature which surrounds. So there's this feeling of human presence and significance through their architecture. We have the house, the farmhouse highlighted, or the industry here, cottage industry. And then we have this massive church that shows up in the background. So the people are enfolded into the landscape. Now let's go back and look at this one by Uccello. This is the earlier Renaissance one. And here you'll notice that the people occupy the whole front panel or the front plane of the image. The focus is on them. They take up like 2/3 of the compositional plane. And so right away we can see that the people are the important actors here, that the landscape becomes the support or foil for what is going on in the scene. So here we say Renaissance humanism. And part of why we come to that is because of the big part human presence has in these artwork. I'm going to bring up this Mary, the Madonna of the Meadow. Notice that even though a large part of the composition is landscape, again, she and the Christ child and John the Baptist are forced into the foreground, and nature present here is part of the background that her world consists of. Notice the sky, as opposed to the Baroque painting, is much more quiet and subtle and plays the role of a background sky. It's still a very, very calm composition. The next time period is the Rococo time period, is in the early part of the 18th century. Rococo art is primarily distinguished by its subject matter and its function, which is to entertain the aristocracy with stories of love and romance that are a reflection of the romantic intrigues that play a part in the royal courts. So it is the art of the aristocracy. These were the people that David was painting for. He was part of the Rococo early on. And if you remember some of the images in that video, this is not dissimilar, with the little Cupid here, Venus lounging on her couch, playing with her little son. And then we have the additional little babies around her. Now, what makes this Rococo? Well, notice the intensity of the color. It's very saturated and almost delicious. Rococo is thought of as ornamented curves based on an S and a C. And how do we see this here? Well, as I zoom into the trees, you can see that there is this kind of curling where you've got this C shape repeated over and over again, representing the foliage or the life that Venus gives. So it's a symbol of her life-giving quality. Notice that her pose is also very, very organic. We have this kind of S curve here in her body and in her pose that are very typical of the Rococo time period. So the emphasis primarily is on courtship, romance, pastoral landscapes, these elegant little landscapes where it's safe to frolic and roam around with your lover. There is no imagery of threatening storms or skies moving. It's just a wonderful, fluffy world where these people can frolic. And its function then is to entertain. Now I'm going to compare again here a Rococo landscape and the two that we've seen before. And this is called the Embarkation for the Island of Cipher by Watteau. And here you can see the same kind of fluffy, billowy shapes and curves throughout the landscape. In terms of the size of the people in the landscape, it's kind of like halfway between these. They are on top of the hill, on top of the world. So this is the aristocracy out for a picnic in the beautiful landscape on their estates. The wealthy and the aristocracy are always the highlighted people in these lands. Notice that the light falls on this grouping here. And then because of aerial perspective, these are getting slightly more faded. Spotlight of high value on these figures subtly implies that they are, more important, they are in control of their world and that the world kind of exists for their entertainment. I'm thinking about the Dutch landscape where this is a world of work and church, cottage industry and the church and the mills on the horizon. Here we have focus only on the entertainment aspect of the wealthy here. Following the Rococo period, we have the neoclassical style, which begins in the 1800s and continues into the early part of the 19th century. So that would be 1750 to about 1850. And you have seen this artwork before in the video about Jacques-Louis David. And what we see here, and I think Schema did a really good job of showing the difference between the fluffiness of the Rococo and this kind of stark classicism that we see in this painting by David. We see organized space as compared to the Watteau picture that we had in the last slide where everything kind of melted together. It was kind of very asymmetrical. Here we have the focus on the action of the people, the story on the stage. And the subject matter itself was a great renewal of interest in Rome and the classics. Roman order, Roman military might and power were all part of the things that were being looked at to replace the frivolousness of the Rococo time period. So often we see in the paintings a much grander scale, hard-edged, no genteel, aristocratic couches to lounge on. Everything seems very purposeful. Here we have a typical neoclassical landscape. To be able to recognize a neoclassical landscape is the presence of ancient ruins, broken columns, decrepit buildings. This makes it a classical landscape. So here is a picture of the Roman Forum. This was the center of the power of the Roman Empire. And so the idea is that there's a loss of this great culture, and that's represented by the ruins themselves. But there's also this feeling of hope and growth in here. We see amongst these great ruins, these smaller, they're kind of little hovels that are planted in here. And then there's this highlight on this building over here, where this building is completed. It's no longer broken down. So that's the suggestion of the renewal of the classical ideal and the growth of this new civilization built on the power and strength of Rome. Also an idealism that's part of this, and as well a contemporary implication of people gesturing. They're telling a story with their body. It's as if he's pointing to these great ruins and the rediscovery of these ruins. We see these people in contemporary clothing. That brings the present into this great story of classical power and art. I put a slide in here about the Enlightenment and the important role it plays in the change of subject matter. This is a painting by Joseph Wright. It's called An Experiment on a Bird in the Air. The subject matter has to do with the new interest in scientific research and the power of science. Notice the obvious distress of this young woman who's thinking about the little bird, and she's distressed at the thought that the bird is going to die. And notice her father explaining how this is very important, right? He's pointing to the actual air pump itself. And notice the light comes here from the center, but the idea then is that science is lighting the darkness of the world around it. Now, with the Enlightenment and with the revolutions, we know that the aristocracy lost political power. The educated, the industrialists became the patrons of art.